Somewhere in Mesopotamia, roughly 7,000 years ago, someone left a jug of wine sitting out in the sun for too long. It wasn't intentional. Storage back then wasn't airtight, and wine wasn't something you could seal and forget the way we do now. A clay jar, a loose covering, a warm room. That was it. That was the whole mistake. Nobody noticed anything happening at first. Wine doesn't scream when it changes. It just sits there quietly while the air does its work. Wild bacteria floating invisibly in that room, the kind that exist everywhere, on everything, all the time, settled onto the surface of the wine and began feeding on the alcohol inside it. Slowly, the alcohol turned into something else entirely. Something sharp. Something sour. Something that stung if you tasted it straight. By any reasonable standard, this wine was ruined. Except it wasn't. It was the birth of one of the most important substances in human history. That sour liquid was vinegar. And unlike almost everything else humans discovered by accident in the ancient world, this one didn't stay a secret in one river valley. It happened again and again, in places that had no contact with each other at all. Wine turned to vinegar in the Fertile Crescent. Beer turned to vinegar in early Chinese villages along the Yellow River. Anywhere humans were fermenting something, that same invisible bacteria was waiting to finish the job they hadn't asked for. Nobody engineered this. Nobody understood what acetic acid was, or why oxygen mattered, or what those invisible organisms were even doing. They just knew that a jar of wine, forgotten long enough, turned into something new. Something that didn't spoil the way spoiled food usually spoiled. Something that seemed to last forever. And here's the part almost nobody expects. This ruined liquid was about to become one of the only medicines that actually worked, one of the only weapons against invisible disease, and one of the only ways to keep an army alive on the march, thousands of years before anyone understood why any of it was true. It started with a mistake nobody wanted. It ended up rewriting how humans fought wars, treated wounds, and preserved food for the next 6,000 years. For a long time, vinegar was just something people had. A byproduct. A leftover. Nobody was chasing it on purpose yet. Then, around the 5th century BCE, a Greek physician named Hippocrates did something that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in this story. He started prescribing it. Hippocrates mixed vinegar with honey into a remedy called oxymel, and he gave it to patients suffering from coughs, fevers, and open wounds. He didn't know why it worked. Nobody would understand bacteria, or germs, or infection at a microscopic level for another 2,000 years. But he had watched it work, over and over, on real patients, and that was enough. You'd think a kitchen ingredient wouldn't belong anywhere near a doctor's bag. It became one of the only things resembling an antiseptic that ancient medicine actually had. And it didn't stay in Greece. Physicians across the ancient Mediterranean started reaching for it the same way. Egyptian healers used vinegar-based treatments for digestive complaints. Roman medical writers documented it as a wound wash, cleaning cuts and injuries with a liquid that, without anyone knowing it, was actively killing the bacteria that caused infection. Think about what that means for a second. An acidic liquid, made completely by accident from spoiled wine, was quietly doing the job of a medicine humanity wouldn't formally invent until the 19th century. Nobody had the word antiseptic. They just had something that kept wounds from turning black and killing the person attached to them. But medicine wasn't the only place vinegar was about to take root, because the Roman military had noticed something too. Roman legionaries were given a daily ration of something called posca, a mixture of vinegar and water, sometimes with herbs added. It wasn't a treat. It wasn't flavor. It was survival equipment. Watered-down vinegar was safer to drink than untreated water on a long march, and soldiers who drank it stayed healthier than those who didn't. Entire legions crossing Gaul, Iberia, and North Africa carried it the way modern armies carry rations and clean water. Pay attention to this, because it explains almost everything that happens next. An empire that built roads spanning 250,000 miles, an empire that conquered half the known world, was quietly keeping its soldiers alive with sour wine and water. Nobody in that legion understood microbiology. They understood something worked. And once something works on a battlefield, it doesn't get forgotten. It gets carried into the next war, and the next one after that. Vinegar had stopped being an accident. It was about to become a weapon. Wars change. Weapons change. Empires rise and collapse and rise again under different flags. But for almost 2,000 years after those Roman legions marched with vinegar in their packs, one thing stayed exactly the same. Nobody had a better way to clean a wound. Battlefield surgery in the ancient and medieval world was brutal in ways that are hard to fully picture. No anesthesia beyond alcohol or opium if you were lucky. No understanding of what actually caused a wound to fester and kill a soldier days after the injury itself. Just infection, spreading silently, and doctors who had no idea what they were fighting. What they did have, sitting in barrels and jars in nearly every camp, was vinegar. And they used it constantly, cleaning cuts, washing surgical tools, soaking bandages, without knowing that the acid in that liquid was doing something close to what modern disinfectant does today. It shouldn't have worked without anyone understanding why. It did anyway. There's a story, still debated by historians, about Hannibal's army crossing the Alps in 218 BCE. According to the account, when his men hit solid rock blocking their path, they heated it with fire and then poured vinegar over it, and the acid helped the stone crack apart faster. Some historians think this is an exaggeration passed down by later Roman writers. Others point out that vinegar really can weaken certain types of rock when combined with heat. Nobody can prove it either way. But the fact that ancient writers believed vinegar was powerful enough to break mountains tells you something about the reputation this liquid had already built. That reputation didn't fade. It traveled forward through every war that followed. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, army field hospitals were still leaning on the exact same substance Roman doctors had used. Surgeons cleaned amputation wounds with vinegar solutions. Nurses used vinegar-soaked cloths on fevers. Nobody had discovered bacteria yet. Louis Pasteur wouldn't publish his germ theory for another half a century. And yet here was an entire continent's worth of military medicine, still quietly relying on a liquid nobody could explain. Then came the American Civil War, and vinegar's role only got bigger. Field surgeons packed it into their kits as one of the only reliable antiseptics available on a battlefield where infection killed far more soldiers than bullets ever did. Union and Confederate medical supply lists both included vinegar by the barrel. Hospitals used it to scrub tables between surgeries. Soldiers were even given diluted vinegar to drink. The same instinct that had kept Roman legionaries alive 2,000 years earlier, still showing up in a war fought with rifles and cannons instead of swords and shields. Think about that for a second. Medicine had changed almost everything else by the 1860s. Anesthesia existed. Surgery had advanced. And yet the frontline defense against infection was still, at its core, the same accidental discovery from a forgotten jug of wine. Nobody had proven why it worked. They just knew that the armies who used it lost fewer men to infection than the ones who didn't. And within just a few decades, someone was finally going to explain exactly why. By the 14th century, Europe was facing something far worse than any battlefield wound. The Black Death was moving through cities and villages, killing an estimated third of the entire population, and nobody had the faintest idea what was actually causing it. There was no germ theory, no concept of bacteria spreading invisibly through air, water, or touch. What people had instead were theories built on fear, religion, and guesswork. And in the middle of that panic, one substance kept showing up as a defense: vinegar. Doctors treating plague victims wore long leather coats and beaked masks stuffed with dried herbs, and many of them soaked cloths in vinegar and pressed them over their mouths and noses before entering a sick room. Households scrubbed their doorways and floors with it. People carried small sponges soaked in vinegar inside hollow pieces of jewelry called pomanders, breathing through them in crowded streets where the disease seemed to spread fastest. Nobody understood bacteria yet. They understood something worked. And out of that desperate, half-informed defense came one of the most famous legends in the entire history of vinegar: the story of the Four Thieves. According to the legend, a group of thieves in plague-ravaged France or Italy, depending on which version you hear, were robbing the homes and bodies of plague victims without ever getting sick themselves. When they were finally caught, the story goes, a judge offered them a lighter sentence in exchange for revealing their secret. They confessed to a special vinegar blend soaked with garlic, herbs, and spices that they rubbed on their skin before every robbery, and it was supposedly what kept the disease from touching them. Historians are honest about this one. There's no solid documentation that these four thieves ever existed. It's most likely folklore, the kind of story that gets attached to a real substance to explain why it seemed to work. But the legend caught on so completely that recipes calling themselves Four Thieves vinegar were being sold in European pharmacies for centuries afterward, marketed as literal protection against plague. Here's what's strange, though. The superstition wasn't entirely wrong. Garlic really does have some antimicrobial properties. Vinegar really is acidic enough to kill certain bacteria on contact. Nobody in the 14th century could have explained any of that scientifically. But layer enough half-understood folk remedies on top of each other, and sometimes you accidentally stumble onto something that actually does a little bit of good, even if the reasoning behind it is completely wrong. Vinegar didn't stop the plague. Nothing available at the time could have. But it became one of the few things people trusted when almost everything else had failed them, and that trust followed it out of the plague years and straight into the next several centuries of daily life. Because while vinegar was busy being medicine and myth and superstition, it was quietly becoming something else entirely. A way to keep food alive. Every civilization that has ever existed has faced the same brutal math. Food spoils. Winters come. Harvests fail. And for most of human history, the difference between a family surviving until spring and a family starving was whether they had figured out how to make their food last. Vinegar turned out to be one of the best answers anyone ever found. Submerge a vegetable in a strong enough acidic liquid, and you create an environment where the bacteria that normally cause rot simply can't survive. Cucumbers, onions, cabbage, eggs, even meat and fish in some traditions could be packed into vinegar and stored for months instead of days. Nobody understood the chemistry of pH levels or bacterial cell walls. They just understood that a jar of vegetables submerged in vinegar was still edible in February, long after the garden that grew them was buried under snow. Pickling spread across nearly every culture that had access to vinegar, and each one made it their own. Northern European households pickled cabbage into something that would eventually become sauerkraut. Middle Eastern kitchens pickled turnips and cucumbers into bright, sour staples served alongside nearly every meal. In parts of Asia, rice vinegar became the base for pickled vegetables that had been part of the culinary tradition for centuries before anyone in Europe had ever tasted it. And then vinegar went to sea. Long ocean voyages in the age of exploration were defined by one relentless problem. Fresh food didn't survive the trip. Sailors on months-long crossings were left with barrels of preserved meat, hardtack, and dried goods, and vinegar became essential cargo on nearly every ship that set sail. It preserved food that had to last for months. It was used to scrub down decks and barrels to keep them from harboring the kind of bacteria that could wipe out a crew. Ship manifests from the 16th and 17th centuries list vinegar alongside salted meat and dried beans as core provisions, not luxuries. Where ships went, vinegar went with them. Spanish and Portuguese vessels carried their wine vinegar traditions into the Americas. English ships brought malt vinegar, made from fermented beer instead of wine, into their colonies, which is why malt vinegar still shows up on fish and chips across England today. French colonists carried their own vinegar-making knowledge into Quebec and the Caribbean. Every empire that crossed an ocean brought its own version of this accidental liquid with it, and every place it landed adapted it into something local. If you're enjoying seeing how far one forgotten jug of wine actually traveled, hit subscribe. I dig into stories exactly like this every week. By the time European colonization had reached nearly every corner of the globe, vinegar wasn't just a leftover from ruined wine anymore. It was a global technology, built independently and reinvented endlessly, doing the same essential job everywhere it existed, keeping food alive long enough for people to survive on it. But nobody in any of these cultures actually knew why it worked. That was about to change. And the person who figured it out wasn't even trying to solve vinegar's oldest mystery. He stumbled onto the answer while chasing something else entirely. By the middle of the 19th century, vinegar had been keeping soldiers healthy, treating wounds, and preserving food for roughly 6,000 years. And in all that time, not a single person on Earth could explain why any of it actually worked. That was about to change, and the man who changed it wasn't even trying to solve vinegar's mystery when he started. Louis Pasteur was a French chemist working on a much more commercial problem. French vinegar producers were losing enormous amounts of product to spoilage and inconsistency, and the industry asked Pasteur to figure out why. In 1864, he published his findings in a study called Études sur le vinaigre, and what he discovered would end up mattering far beyond the vinegar barrels of France. Pasteur proved that vinegar wasn't just a chemical reaction happening on its own. It was alive. A specific type of bacteria, floating in the air and settling onto wine or beer, was consuming the alcohol and converting it into acetic acid as part of its own life cycle. The bacteria weren't ruining the liquid. They were the entire process. Think about what that means. For 6,000 years, every soldier who drank posca, every doctor who cleaned a wound, every household that pickled vegetables for winter, had been relying on living organisms they couldn't see and had no name for. Pasteur didn't just explain vinegar. He revealed that an invisible living process had been quietly running the ancient world's medicine cabinet the entire time. And here's the detail almost nobody expects. This vinegar research came before Pasteur's far more famous work on germ theory and disease. The same insight that let him understand how bacteria transform wine into vinegar became the foundation for the discovery that bacteria cause disease in humans. Vinegar, the accidental byproduct of forgotten wine, had led one of history's greatest scientists directly to the idea that would eventually save millions of lives in hospitals around the world. Once vinegar's biology was understood, producers stopped waiting for accidents to happen and started engineering the process on purpose. Traditional methods like the Orleans process, where barrels of wine were left exposed to air in wooden casks for weeks while bacteria slowly did their work, had produced vinegar the old way for centuries. But a faster method called the Schützenbach process, developed in Germany, pushed air through wood shavings coated in bacteria, cutting production time from weeks down to days. For the first time in human history, vinegar could be manufactured instead of discovered. And that single shift was about to split vinegar's story in two, the same way it had already happened to nearly every food humans once made by hand. Once vinegar could be manufactured instead of discovered by accident, everything about it changed at industrial speed. Factories using the Schutzenbach process and its descendants could produce vinegar in days instead of the weeks or months traditional methods required. Acetic acid concentrations could be standardized, so a bottle of vinegar bought in one city tasted identical to a bottle bought in another, something that had never been true in the entire 6,000-year history of the product before this. By the early 20th century, vinegar had become a supermarket commodity, sitting on shelves in mass-produced glass bottles, cheap enough that almost nobody thought twice about it. For a while, that seemed like an unambiguous win. Consistent, affordable, available everywhere. Except somewhere along the way, something got lost. Traditional vinegar makers in certain regions had never stopped doing things the old way, and it turned out the old way was producing something industrial vinegar simply couldn't replicate. In Medina, Italy, families had been aging balsamic vinegar in a sequence of wooden barrels, each made from a different type of wood, for years and sometimes decades, letting the liquid slowly evaporate and concentrate as it moved from barrel to barrel. This wasn't vinegar you made in days. This was vinegar that could take 12 years, 25 years, or longer before it was ready to leave the barrel at all. A bottle of true aged balsamic vinegar from Medina, made under strict traditional rules, can sell for well over $100 for just a few ounces. Some rare, decades-old bottles sell for far more than that. Meanwhile, a bottle of ordinary distilled vinegar sits on a nearby supermarket shelf for barely $2. Both of them are vinegar. Both of them trace back to the same ruined jug of wine 7,000 years ago. But one of them is a commodity, and the other is treated like a rare, aged wine. That same split happened everywhere vinegar existed. Traditional producers of sherry vinegar in Spain, aged in barrels once used for sherry itself, kept their slow methods alive even as industrial vinegar took over most of the market. Rice vinegar makers in Japan continued centuries-old fermentation techniques for the vinegar used in proper sushi rice, even as cheaper versions flooded grocery stores worldwide. In Britain, malt vinegar production scaled into massive factories, yet artisanal producers still exist, brewing it slowly from fermented barley the way it had always been done. And then vinegar found an entirely new identity in the modern world, one that had nothing to do with medicine, war, or preservation. Wellness culture. Apple cider vinegar, once just another regional variation used mostly for cooking and pickling, exploded into a global health trend, marketed for everything from digestion to weight loss to blood sugar control. Some of those claims have real scientific support behind them. Others are exaggerated far beyond what the evidence actually shows. But the fact that a 6,000-year-old kitchen accident was suddenly being sold in trendy glass bottles with droppers and health claims printed on the label tells you something about how far this liquid had traveled from that first forgotten jar of wine. Today, the global vinegar industry produces millions of tons of the stuff every single year, spread across dozens of distinct traditions, from Chinese black vinegar to Filipino coconut vinegar to the balsamic aging cellars of Italy. Every culture that ever touched this accident made it their own. And that adaptability turns out to be the real reason this story never ended. The real question about vinegar was never how it was discovered. That part was an accident, a jug of wine left out too long in a warm room. The question is why it never went away. Why did a substance nobody planned for end up embedded in medicine, war, religion, food, and now wellness culture, across nearly every civilization that has ever existed? Part of the answer is practical. Vinegar solved problems that never stopped existing. Food still spoils. Wounds still get infected. For most of human history, before refrigeration and antibiotics and modern sanitation, vinegar was one of the only tools available against both of those threats at once. It didn't need to be understood to work. It just needed to be there, in a jar, in a barrel, in a soldier's ration, doing its job quietly while the people using it had no idea why. And when the survival need started to fade, when refrigeration made food preservation easier and modern medicine made antiseptics unnecessary, vinegar didn't fade with it. Because somewhere along the way, it had stopped being just a tool and become a flavor. The bright bite of malt vinegar on fried fish. The deep sweetness of balsamic drizzled over strawberries. The clean sourness that makes pickled vegetables addictive instead of just edible. These aren't survival strategies anymore. They're pleasures billions of people choose every single day, long after they had any real need to. The other part of the answer is cultural. Vinegar never demanded loyalty to one tradition. The French turned it into an aged luxury. The Japanese folded it into the identity of their most famous dish. The British made it a condiment nobody questions. The Americans, once again, took something old and turned it into a wellness trend sold in bottles with droppers. Every place vinegar landed, it absorbed the character of that place instead of overwriting it. That is the legacy of one forgotten jug of wine, left out in a room in Mesopotamia 7,000 years ago. It became the medicine cabinet of the ancient world. It became a soldier's daily ration through empires that no longer exist. It became a weapon against a plague nobody understood. It became the reason ships could survive months at sea. It became the accidental doorway to one of the most important scientific discoveries in medical history. And it never once stopped being useful. Somewhere right now, a barrel of balsamic is quietly aging in a cellar in Medina, exactly the way it has for centuries. Somewhere a bottle of apple cider vinegar is sitting on a kitchen counter, bought by someone chasing a health trend without knowing they're holding the same substance Roman soldiers once drank to survive a march. Somewhere a plate of sushi is being served with rice seasoned by a tradition centuries old. And somewhere, in a factory that never sleeps, millions of gallons of ordinary vinegar are being bottled for supermarket shelves around the world. All of it traces back to one accident. One jug of wine someone forgot to seal. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me which everyday ingredient you think deserves its own documentary. And if this video taught you something new, smash that like button so more people can find it.